Good evening, everyone. My name is Sarah Ward, and I'm the Communications and Events Manager for the Maureen and Mike Mansfield Center. I am generally behind the scenes for events like this, and so it is an honor to join you tonight to introduce our speaker. The Mansfield Center was founded by an act of Congress in 1983 to honor the legacy of Senator Mike Mansfield and his wife, Maureen Hayes Mansfield. We work to bridge divides on local, national, and international levels and to support American democracy. The Mansfield Dialogues play a critical role in this mission and foster unique opportunities for conversations of national and international importance for audiences across the Rocky Mountain West and the world. Today's dialogue provides us the opportunity to connect with Owen for a discussion on Israel, Gaza, and the Middle East in light of last month's one-year anniversary of the Hamas attack. As an adjunct faculty at the Maureen and Mike Mansfield Center's Defense Critical Language and Culture program, Owen has taught U.S. Army Special Forces soldiers and the intelligence community personnel since 2008. Prior to moving to Missoula, he was a senior intelligence officer on the Middle East at the U.S. Defense Intelligence Agency. He is the author of several books on the intelligence services and covert action strategies of several Middle East countries, including Iran's Quds, proxy wars, terror, and Iran's war on America. He is a graduate of Georgetown University, the Naval War College, and the National Intelligence University. Currently, he is pursuing his PhD at King's College London. He brings a wealth of knowledge to UM's campus, and we are incredibly grateful that he could join us tonight for this critical conversation. We received a number of questions in advance that we will address during the Q&A. For those joining us via the live stream, we encourage you to submit your questions for Owen using the Q&A feature on Microsoft Teams. If you have difficulty submitting questions via Teams, please email your questions to my colleague, Matthew Spar. For in-person attendees, we of course encourage you to ask questions during the Q&A and join us after the event for a reception outside the theater. Thank you again for your support of the Mansfield Dialogues. Now it is my pleasure to welcome Owen to the stage.
All right. How is everybody out there tonight? Good, good. All right. You know, it's interesting when you talk about Gaza, Israel, West Bank. These are loaded issues. And I've had more than a few people say, why are you going to lecture on that? You know, it's such a sensitive topic. There's a lot of passion among people about this. And when I was driving over here tonight, I thought, I think it was about 10 years ago, for those of you who remember. It wasn't here, it was over in the ballroom. And I was on a panel with two other individuals talking about Gaza. And one of those members was, I'm going to show a little bit of bias here, was an ex-Israeli general with a bullet head and red wireframe glasses. And the other person on the panel was a colleague of mine, very, very impassionate about Gaza. And of course, the fireworks just flew. There was, you know, people were gesticulating, and I had the Israeli general seated beside me. He's like, "Are you going to put a stop to this? Are you going to put a stop to this? This is outrageous, you know." And finally, my colleague just got up and walked out of the room. And I think if I were to be seated where you are now, I'd be like the proverbial deer in headlights, like, whoa, you know, what the heck just happened here? So yes, this is an issue that even 12 years ago, when a lot of the people protesting on campuses were much younger, this was an issue that galvanized people. So we're going to talk about Gaza. And I always like to do this because I was raised in the U.S. military tradition, you know, to give the bottom line up front, right? And so here it is. Gaza has been a flashpoint of conflict for a long time. This is nothing new, all right? The degree of the violence is something new, I would argue, but the conflict goes back a long, long time. And it's a moving dartboard when you want to throw it, all right? When did it really begin? I settle on the 48, 49 period. The birth of the State of Israel. The invasion of Israel by virtually all of its neighbors. A war that was fought and then concluded with the defeat of most of Israel's neighbors. 7 October 2023 is an important milestone. And why is that? It's the degree of the violence. The fact that here we are, over a year later, and the violence is still happening. It's still going on. This is not like previous Gaza wars. The Israelis are used to imposing their will on their neighbors and being done with it quickly. That's the kind of war they like to have. For those of you who remember the Six-Day War, right, 1967, they imposed their will on all of their neighbors and came away victorious. But lately, and by lately I mean the last 20 years or so, these wars have ground on and on and on and on. And this is not the kind of war that the Israeli Defense Forces like to fight. This was a surprise Hamas attack. Surprise, and yet I still scratch my head thinking, how the hell was this a surprise? The Israelis monitor, like no other country except maybe the Chinese, right, their population. And they're not monitoring Israeli Jews, they're monitoring Arabs. How the hell did this happen without them detecting it? I mean, this was not just a fly-by-night operation, the Hamas attack. This took planning, it took organization. 1,200 Israelis were killed. Now, think about this. This is a country of 10 million people, Israel. 1,200, mainly civilians, were killed, murdered. Now, this had an impact, and it still does. It's a year later, and we're the rest of the world, right? We're like, all right, are we going to get to peace at some point? Are we going to get to a ceasefire? But neither side is ready for this yet. No way. Abducted hundreds. Maybe 100 are still, if they're still alive, somewhere in Gaza, right? Somewhere. The place is riddled with tunnels. There was Israeli retaliation, and it's still ongoing. I mean, we're seeing this right now. A blockade of the Gaza Strip. Nothing really new. The Israelis have always imposed a blockade of one kind or another on Gaza. Mass population displacement. I mean, basically going on loudspeakers and saying, 1 million people, you got to leave. You got to head south. And then, of course, the invasion. So what now? The Israeli Defense Forces occupy parts of Gaza. Give or take maybe 2 divisions. But, Israel's now involved in another war in Lebanon as well, where they've had to divert a lot of their military capabilities. No transition to peace or stability operations. Now, I'm thinking of our own experience, Afghanistan, Iraq, right? It's hard for militaries to do stability ops. They don't like doing it. There's a reason for it. You're not necessarily trained to do this sort of thing. You're trained to go in, blow down the doors, get rid of the enemy, neutralize in the polite phrase, right? And then move on, and hopefully the State Department or the UN or some other entity will come in and take care of business. The Israeli Defense Forces are no different, but they don't have an excuse. They've been in this occupation business now with the occupied territory since 1967. It's like, all right, you don't want to do it? Come on, guys. This is 2024. Gaza's in a holding pattern. Hamas is defiant, such as it is, right? I mean, it's been beheaded with Yahya Sinwar's death. There's been no development aid, or very little. And we went through this great effort to build a pier, and it was a bit of a fiasco because, classic American development pattern. We spent, I don't know how many hundreds of millions of dollars to put this thing in place. And then there was a storm, and part of it was washed up. It didn't work that well. The thing that has my attention is that there's no governance. or there's kind of a shadow government, right? There's the Israeli Defense Forces monitoring these corridors. There's Hamas, which is now driven underground. And there are gangs starting to emerge, right? It's the classic Mogadishu scenario. There's a government, but there isn't a government. The Israeli government, and we'll get to this in a minute, I mean, it's effectively paralyzed in terms of how they want to respond, in terms of the willingness to respond. So let's settle some controversies first. The 1967 war. What do we mean by occupied territories? What do we mean by the word Palestinian? The heart of the matter, right? And then we'll dig into Gaza. And I promise I'll move through the history stuff quickly. But I always start my classes on this topic with this war. I wasn't even born yet. That's how long ago it is, right? I got a few gray hairs. Gaza was administered by the Egyptians, by a ruler named Gamal Abdel Nasser. The West Bank was claimed by Jordan. In fact, the Jordanians said at that time, this doesn't belong to Palestine, this is part of Jordan. East Jerusalem, very, very important piece of real estate. It's where you got the Haram al-Sharif. It's where you got Al-Aqsa Mosque. It's where you got the Wailing Wall, the Western Wall, right? There is literally one very important religious site for one religion built on top of a religious site for another religion. And therein lies all the problems. Sinai belonged to Egypt. Golan, forget about the Golan Heights, belonged to Syria. There was a preemptive Israeli attack. Now, we can get into some of the nuances of what we mean by preemption. But when Abdel Nasser of Egypt was saying, we're gonna push them into the Mediterranean, them, the Jews, that was what he said. So the Israelis said, all right, you're provoking us. They destroyed the Egyptian Air Force in one day. They invaded Sinai. And then when that wasn't enough, they went after West Bank and they went after Golan. And so at the end of this war, Israel was occupying Arab majority lands. So this is the Israeli view of 1967, the soldiers at the Western Wall. I mean, for them, this is an evocative moment, right? From 1948 to 1967, this is the remnant of a temple. It's very important in the Jewish faith. It was in the hands of the Jordanians. And here they are, these Israeli soldiers have broken through, and it's a very emotional moment for them. And look at the dates. I love the dates, right? This is the biblical Middle East, 587 BC, 70 AD. Really, we're talking about the time of Jesus Christ. The Palestinian view is very different. Al-Naqsa. They got all these very evocative words. Al-Nakba, the catastrophe. Al-Naqsa, the setback. For them, this is what happened, right? These are Palestinians lined up on the wall. Civilians, most likely. These kinds of conflicts, you just don't know. But, you know, they're being shaken down to see if they have weapons. I mean, for the Palestinians, a lot of them, this is when a lot of their current humiliation and misery began. So these are occupied territories. The land seized in war from Jordan, Egypt, Syria, with a very large Palestinian population. In fact, Jordan is about 50-50 Palestinian versus Bedouin, Arab, Jordanian. Here's where you get to some of the fuzziness of what it means to have an identity like this, right? So when we talk about identity, this is very important. The new American ambassador to Israel, Mike Huckabee, look him up on Google, said there's no such thing as a Palestinian. Huh. You know, this is where you have to step back and scratch your head. And where the hell did that come from? Well, it's as old as the conflict itself, right? Palestinian, Philistine, the Bible, Arab. Can you be an Arab and a Palestinian? Of course. Can you be Arab, Palestinian, and a Christian? Yeah. This is where you get to the idea of identity, right? United States citizen, but a Florida resident and a Cuban American. To name our new Secretary of State, he's all three of these, right? Marco Rubio. The Middle East is no different in the fungibility, the plasticity. I'm sounding like a boring professor now. It's no different when you're talking about identities. There's a Palestinian identity. I guarantee you, you go to Gaza, if you're brave enough, and the Israelis let you in, or you go to Ramallah in the West Bank, you're not going to find a single soul is going to say, I'm not Palestinian, right? I'm an Arab. I mean, they craft the response to the question that's being asked and who's asking the question. This is very sensitive. Golda Meir, Prime Minister of Israel, spent some time in Iowa. This is where the complexity of our relationship with Israel. She once said that the Israelis found a land without a people for a people without a land. Right? This is part of the mythology of the foundation of Israel. There was no one there. And we walked in and we set up shop. This is why, for Palestinians, this is such a damn sensitive issue, because they're like, we're here. We were here back then, and we're going to be here tomorrow. And when people think, why are they not fleeing in Gaza, right? Why aren't they just leaving? The Israelis are telling them to leave. Well, part of it is historical memory of this period. I'm not going to get up and leave, because the Israelis, the Jews, are going to take it from me, and I'm never going to get it back. That happened to grandpa, right? Or great grandpa, and it's not going to happen to me. I mean, there is a cussedness that's built into both of the peoples in this conflict, right? They're related. I love the sound of the greetings, right? Salam alaikum is Arabic for peace upon you. Shalom aleichem. I'm not an expert in Hebrew, but we all know that that means peace upon you in Hebrew. Amazing, isn't it? These languages are related, and yet these people despise each other like probably only the most closely related possibly can, right? Palestinians are also Arabs. This is broader identity. Most Palestinians are Muslims. The Palestinian diaspora. Here's another word, right? Amazing how one people who still do have a diaspora. I mean, there are probably more people of the Jewish faith in the United States than in Israel, but the Palestinians are the same. They have a diaspora. Dearborn, Michigan. We're going to touch on election issues. Syria, Lebanon. They've been living in these countries for a hell of a long time, and they are not citizens of those countries. In fact, Bashar al-Assad, the dictator of Syria, decided that he was going to clean out one of these camps a few years ago because they were not simpatico with his regime. It sucks to be a refugee, doesn't it? 75 years, you're born a refugee. They are citizens of Jordan. The exception. There's no citizenship in the territories, right? Because the United States government's position is that this is not a country yet. It's the Palestinian Authority. It's not Palestine. And by the way, there are a bunch of other countries, but we generally take the lead on these issues, and countries like Canada, Australia, and Great Britain follow our lead on this. So let's talk Gaza. 360 square kilometers, 40 clicks of coast. Sorry, I used metric, partly because the order from on high when I'm teaching the military audiences, they better get used to metric, because when they go overseas, that's what everybody else talks. Borders Israel and Egypt, but that's it. And most of the borders with Israel. Gaza is isolated. It's got a coastline, but it's effectively isolated. Israel has always controlled the airspace. You can't hop on a plane in Frankfurt and fly to Gaza. It's not going to happen. And they control the coastline. A couple of years ago, the Turks tried to send in an aid ship, and the Israelis said, you're not coming in here. We're the ones who control the coastline. For those of you with experience in the greater New York metropolitan area, that's Gaza, right? A little bit bigger than Manhattan, covers some of the, a little bit of Queens, a little bit of the Bronx, a little bit of Jersey. That's it. That's how small it is, really. I mean, in terms of geographical size. 2 million people, give or take. The language is Arabic. Yeah, it's Arabic. They're Arabs. They're also Palestinians. They have their own dialect of Arabic, right? I mean, this is one of the funny things about the Arab world is that, they'll be emphatic about the identity, but you go from Morocco to Saudi Arabia and the dialects are not necessarily entirely comprehensible. 98% Muslim. Now, right, this is like, my gosh, there's a lot of Muslims there. Now, between individuals, as we know, in his human nature, right, whether you pray 5 times a day depends on the person. But I mean, the identifier, if you were going to ask a Gazan, he or she, what is your religion? It's going to be Islam. The 2%, probably Palestinian Christians, but most of those live in the West Bank, the other enclave. Median age is 18. 18. Think about this. The median age is 18. I mean, this is a very young population. And that has implications as well, if you're on the Israeli side of the ledger. Population growth rate about 2% a year. This is a contained area. It's not like, yeah, I'm going to move. It's getting kind of crowded here. I'm going to go to West Bank. The Israelis are not going to let you do that. Life expectancy is pretty high. Lest we think, my God, this is like Mother Teresa in Calcutta. No, it's actually because of all of the Arab money that has flowed into Gaza over the decades, Qatar, United Arab Emirates, Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, they actually, before the October 23rd incident, had a decent healthcare system and decent education system. Now, we got to talk about occupation. First Israeli settlement within months of the Six-Day War, all right? Months. Now, a settlement means I'm coming in here, I'm going to plant my flag, and this is great soil for growing oranges, Jaffa oranges. And if you're a Palestinian living on that land, tough beans, well, wait a minute. What gives you the right, right? Here's where you get international law thrown into all this. Eventually, they had 21 settlements. The Israelis effectively occupied about 20% of Gaza at one point. And, there's all kinds of ideology behind this. Recapturing lost Jewish lands. Here you go to your Bible, right? All right, so there was a Gaza back in the time of the Old Testament. Actually, a very wealthy little city on the coastline because it connected the spice and incense routes from Arabia. That means it's got to be Israeli, right? It was back then, it's going to be now. Security, divide and conquer, right? This is old stuff. Exploiting valuable land. I'm not going to mention any names tonight, but there was a certain relative of our incoming president who said in the last 6 months that actually northern Gaza, it'd be great to build some hotels there, right? Why don't we build hotels there? We'll kick the Palestinians out, that was implied, and build these hotels. I mean, this is primo real estate in some sense. The settlements required protection 24/7. You are literally there surrounded by people who don't want you there. And so, yes, there's been opposition. There's been opposition all along. Insurgencies, 2 intifadas, an Arabic word that's almost entered our own language, right? An uprising, the kid throwing the stone at the tank. They formed an organization called the Palestine Liberation Organization, which from the very beginning opposed the creation of the State of Israel. This is part of the ancient history here. Some PLO were terrorists. That's the Munich Olympics. 11 Israeli athletes murdered by a group called Black September. The picture above it is Dawson's Field. Someone in the audience tonight was reminding me a little bit about what happened at Dawson's Field. 3 airliners hijacked, taken to a place just outside of Amman, Jordan. Now this is, I don't know, it's almost kind of quaint, right? They took all the passengers off the planes, put them in these, it's probably stinking hot, but then blew up the planes. This is pre-Al-Qaeda, right? Suicide bomber stuff. Then comes the Oslo Accords, an agreement, a framework. It's not a peace treaty, right? There were too many people at the time who said, oh my God, we've solved all the Middle East problems. Look at it. Bill Clinton got Rabin and Arafat to shake hands. And you know, Rabin, if you've ever seen the video imagery of it, he was really, really, really uncomfortable. He's a general in a previous existence. And here he's shaking hands with the enemy. Now, Arafat, being Arafat, nothing to lose, right? And Rabin, being very stiff, finally, shakes his hand. It was a framework. The idea was very optimistic, right? 5 years, inshallah, right? God willing. 5 years, there'll be peace. There'll be an Israeli withdrawal. There'll be a transfer of authority. The Palestinians will get to run their own show. Maybe, although it's kind of vague about this, have their own country. And by the way, there's Bill Clinton, right? We were part of this process. We injected ourselves into this process, actually. It made for a good photo op for the American president. Now, there were some things that all the optimists decided to forget about at the time. Israelis still controlled the airspace and the borders. They still had settlements. And not just a settlement here, a settlement there. I mean, at that time, I think it was 250,000 people were settlers in the West Bank, the other enclave. In any case, this Palestinian Authority was set up. September 1995, more transition. It looked promising. It did look promising, even for the skeptics and dyed-in-the-wool skeptics, right? It's never going to happen. There's going to be no peace. But it was happening. The problems were, well, one, Rabin got assassinated. He wins a peace prize. A general wins a peace prize and then gets assassinated by a settler, Jewish settler. The Palestinian Authority all along, right? This is nothing new here. Corruption, mismanagement, extortion, nepotism. This is not a very good government. Now, by Middle East standards, the bar is really low. That's not that bad. They just torture some people every now and then, that kind of stuff. But not to sound overly cynical about this, but this is not the people riding in on the white horse who are going to clean up and change everything. Then there's this group, Hamas. Hamas is actually an acronym for Islamic movement. And it also means, the word Hamas means enthusiasm, the idea of a movement that's energized. It was, it was created relatively late in the game. The ideologies become important. PLO, Palestine Liberation Organization. There's no Islam anywhere in that title, by the way, because this is a different time frame. This is a time frame when the Palestinian movement was all about secular Arab nationalism and socialism. Weird, right? Doesn't seem to fit times of today, but that's what it was. Hamas, unabashedly an Islamic movement. I mean, it's in the name, Islamic Resistance Movement. Created in '87, so younger. It always offered an alternative to the PLO. The alternative was Islam. There's a saying, Islam huwa al-hal. It means Islam is the solution. It's utopian, but it's always good for a movement to have a catchy, slogan. Islam's the solution. Build it and they'll come. We'll build an Islamic state in Gaza, and we will have this perfect end. Everything will be great, right? I mean, I'm being a little bit facetious, but this is politics. You have to be somewhat cynical about it. And by the way, not that they like to admit it now, But the Israelis had a nice, convenient relationship with Hamas back then. They were the alternative, the opposition to the PLO, Israel's sworn enemy. The enemy of my enemy is my friend, even if in the future he's going to be my enemy again, right? This is the Middle East. So as much as they like to pretend that Hamas is just beyond the pale, there's another expression from a different period in Jewish history. But think about this. I mean, covertly backed by the Israelis. All right, that Oslo process ground to a halt. I mentioned Rabin's assassination. Hamas never wanted peace then, and I would argue they don't want it now. They're inching towards it, right? And then you'll get a leader like Yahya Sinwar who drags them back. But they're not. We're not at the point where Hamas as a movement is willing to recognize the state of Israel's right to exist, okay? Hamas waged a terror bombing campaign. These are bus bombings, discotheque bombing in downtown Tel Aviv, killed a bunch of people. And it was just one after the other, after the other, after the other. And for Israelis who were initially optimistic that maybe there would be peace, there began this realization it's never going to happen. Around this time, a certain politician named Benjamin Netanyahu appears on the scene. Have you ever seen him speak English? I mean, he speaks English with an American accent because he grew up in New York, at least for some of his years. His father was an official at the UN. And Netanyahu, from the very beginning, was hostile to Oslo. He did not want this to happen. He had a lot of suspicions. The Palestinians are never going to be a party that we can negotiate with. I mean, he was pretty emphatic about that. Another intifada. And in 2005, under a different prime minister, another Israeli general named Ariel Sharon, the Israelis basically said, keeping settlements, 21 of them in Gaza, just not worth it. You know, they're small settlements. They're surrounded by Palestinians who are very hostile. We are expending blood and treasure to keep these settlements. So you know what? We're withdrawing. Big decision point, by the way. This is the first time that the Israelis who are occupying Arab land decide, all right, maybe we'll step back, right, and take our settlements with us. And by the way, you know, just this is the Google age, right? Go to YouTube, and you will see the demonstrations and the anger among the settlers. How dare you? You're destroying our livelihoods. We made this land produce something, and they, Palestinians, will ruin it, right? I mean, there's a lot of passion here. Here's where we come into the picture. Again, different president, George W. Bush. We're already 3 years into Iraq at this point. And this democratization agenda becomes a big thing in the Bush White House. The best solution for the Middle East and why we're really in Iraq in 2006 is to create a democracy. Because democracies don't go to war with each other. It's a peaceful form in a relative sense of government, right? I mean, go back to that time period and read some of the stuff that was being produced by the White House, and I'm literally, this is not off the mark. And so the Bush White House goes to the Israelis and to the Palestinian Authority, right? And said, you should have elections in the occupied territories. Now, the PLO, which is running the West Bank and Gaza at the time, I don't know if it'd be a good idea to have elections because we don't know what's going to come out at the end of it. Now, of course, for American diplomats, it was like, what do you mean you don't know what's going to come out? If you're as popular as you say you are, you're going to win, right? And at least now you'll have the popular mandate of the people. Hamas won. Shock and dismay, right? Even in the White House, where they should not have been so shocked and so dismayed, that a group that we had on our terrorism list is now won a plurality in an election in the Palestinian territories. For a while there, the PLO and the Hamas, two very different ideologies, right? Secular, socialist. nationalist, Islamist. They're trying to make it work, but they can't. Fighting erupts, and what we have today is the situation. PLO, Palestinian Authority, controls the West Bank, bits and pieces of it, right? They don't have total control over any of it, really. Hamas is left in control of Gaza. So two very different kinds of Palestinian governments. No elections since then. So I love it when they describe Mahmoud Abbas, who's the head of the Palestinian Authority. What's this? He's like year 17, year 18 into a 4-year mandate because they've never had elections since. All right. Hamas has rejected Israel's right to exist. Okay, that is in their statements and in their doctrine. So from the very beginning, you had this built-in animosity, layer upon layer upon layer of suspicion on both sides. Hamas began to arm itself. Now, how the hell did they do it? This is the mystery, you know, for a former intel geek like me. It's like, man, it's totally surrounded. There's that little border with Egypt. But how the hell do Iranians smuggle missiles and rockets into a totally surrounded territory? There's a will, there's a way. Tunnels, 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 and more tunnels. Egyptian officials who can be bribed, the Iranians who are determined to destroy the state of Israel. I don't think that's rhetoric. I think that's their legitimate point of view. They found a way of smuggling weapons in. And you know what? Over time, the weapons got bigger and bigger, and the ranges of the rockets got further. So you see, they're creeping pretty damn close to Tel Aviv at the time of this graphic. Now, that's not the capital of Israel, but it might as well be, right? It's the commercial heart of Israel. It's the cultural heart of Israel. It's what makes Israel work. And you have this opposition group with weapons that can reach Tel Aviv. And so there have been cycles of violence. I started my talk tonight by mentioning a Gaza crisis from 10 or 12 years ago. It's nothing new. It's just previous conflicts. They found an off-ramp pretty quickly to ramp it down. All right. My God. I'm finally getting to the good stuff. 7 October 2023. Again, this was an attack that should not have been a surprise. And there's all kinds of conspiracy theories in Israel about this, and I'm not going to go into those. You know, maybe they really did know and wanted it to happen. Yeah, right. But it was well planned. It was well executed. Rockets, drones, these guys on paragliders. I mean, we see this going off, you know, Mount Sentinel, right? During the summer when they fly off the mountain and they land. Hamas had these things. Now, you can't tell me they weren't flying. I mean, I'm assuming that you need some training, right, to use these things. And the Israelis didn't notice any of this? I mean, there are a lot of questions about this period. The security barrier that the Israelis had built around Gaza, I mean, it was almost like a Berlin Wall. They had automatic machine gun emplacements so that literally a guy or gal could be 10, 12 miles away, look on the video monitor, see someone coming towards the barrier, you issue the alarm, and if they're still going towards the barrier, you push the button and it's push button death. Apparently they weren't working. The cameras weren't working, right? This is where the conspiracy theories start. How the heck do the Israeli Defense Forces fall down flat on their faces with this barrier that cost a lot of US taxpayer money? He didn't say that, did he? And it didn't work. The Israelis were caught by surprise, a religious holiday. 1973, they were caught by surprise. 6 October, one day before this one, 1973. Now, I was very young then, and I have no memory of it, but I mean, that was the last big Arab-Israeli war. How the heck do you get surprised on one of your high holy days so many times, right? I mean, and people say the same about 9/11. How the Americans couldn't be caught off guard by this, you know. There had to have been an inside job. I mean, this is where a lot of nonsense gets said. 1,100 Israeli citizens killed, 250 hostages. The Israeli Defense Forces, remember, this is a conscript army. It's not, I mean, they have a cadre of NC, non-commissioned officers, but for the most part, when they mobilize, they're taking it from the population. And so you read the articles in the magazines, you know, one moment, the guy or gal is the founder of a startup company. Israel's famous for this stuff. And it's like, yeah, you know, I'm 3 months into my military tour. I don't know what's happening with my company, right? I want to be demobilized so I can go back and figure out what's been going on while I've been away. This hurts the Israeli economy when you mobilize that many people in a country of 10 million, most definitely. I don't know how many Palestinians have died. The number that everybody throws out there is from the Hamas-controlled Ministry of Health, all right? I, by nature, do not like hearing numbers from one of the parties whose natural interest is to inflate the numbers. Could be more. I don't think anyone really knows. But 42,000 sounds like a hell of a lot of people, right? Killed. Israelis ordered 1 million to leave North Gaza. We're going to clear it out because they want to remove all the rocket launchers. Head south and don't come back. Then they imposed a blockade. And here, I think, in a lot of ways, the Israelis are their own worst damn enemies. They do this over and over again. And as a sympathetic, I said it, outsider, I see them and I scratch my head and go, this is such a PR nightmare. What the hell do you think you're going to accomplish by starving people, denying them water and fuel for their electricity generators so they can power their hospitals? Well, their hospitals are shields for Hamas. Yeah, they probably are. But that still doesn't justify having people die because there's no electricity for the generators in the hospitals. We have been involved in this from the beginning. And look, I'm going to inject myself a little bit into the political debate in this country because it's unavoidable. As much as President Biden wanted to achieve some sort of ceasefire, his influence is like this little over Benjamin Netanyahu. They do not like each other. This goes back, this animosity on the part of Benjamin Netanyahu for the American Democratic Party goes back to Barack Obama days. It's paradoxical because 75% of Jewish people in this country vote Democrat. So again, you got to get into some of the politics here to understand why we have so little influence in our government right now over what the Israelis do. These are the dilemmas of this guy, all right? He's under a lot of domestic criticism. He's got a case hanging over him in the Israeli courts that he knows that the moment he steps down from his position as prime minister, he could find himself in jail. Now, I don't think it's going to happen. He's a powerful individual, but this is what he faces. So even before 7 October, Israeli society was racked by all kinds of unrest, right? They wanted to shake up the Supreme Court and change the rules. Wow, you know, some of this sounds eerily familiar. And it was big domestic controversies in Israel. And if you're Hamas and you're sitting back and watching this and going, this is a divided society. And these people are ripping themselves to pieces. Big demonstrations in Tel Aviv over this. And it's aimed at this guy. He's under indictment, fraud, bribery. He has what is, by anyone's measure, the most right-wing coalition cabinet in Israel's history, 75 years. He has next to no maneuver room. And what do I mean by this? Well, I think the graph probably says it best. His coalition controls 61 seats in the Knesset. The opposition coalition controls 59 seats. Kind of familiar, right? That's like our own House of Representatives, at least up until the election. He had a one-seat majority. But what it means for Netanyahu is he's not dealing with one party, like the Republican Party with a one-seat majority in the House of Representatives. This is a coalition. He cannot afford to lose anyone in his coalition. And that means from the farthest to the right, ultra-Orthodox party in Israel saying, don't you make any peace deal with Hamas. Don't even think about it. Because our constituents, I mean, you can come up with a number, but it's a relatively small percentage of the Israeli population, do not want this. Razor thin majority. And the result is paralysis. So that's one problem Netanyahu faces. The other one is frankly, the IDF generals, they're kind of frustrated. And you know, this is Israel. And I'm always tickled pink by the Israelis because when you read their media, these guys are their own worst leakers. They leak all the time. It is a democracy in that sense, that the media will basically go to an Israeli general and say, what do you think about what Netanyahu's doing? I think the guy's a son of a bitch. He's thrown us into this mix in Gaza and we can't get out of it, right? Write it down, put it in the paper. And it's kind of jarring, especially if you're Hamas. Think if you're Hamas, you're an authoritarian movement, your message is consistent. Everybody's got to echo it. And here is the other side. They're all over the map. And the Israeli generals are very frustrated. Partly because Netanyahu didn't take any of the blame for 7 October. Not my fault. It was the Israeli Defense Forces who fell flat on their faces and had all those people get murdered. Not my fault. And I can tell you, as an institution, the IDF does not appreciate this kind of criticism. Some of it is probably merited. After all, the cameras weren't working. These automatic kill machine guns weren't working. I mean, I don't know. But as far as they're concerned, classic military, right? Military-civilian relationship. We did our job. We went in and we rousted Hamas. Killed 40,000 plus Palestinian civilians, but we killed Hamas. Now it's up to you, politicians, Israeli Interior Ministry, to do your part of the job. This is an old story, by the way. This is U.S. military, 2006, right? The State Department isn't doing their job. They've left the U.S. Army hanging out there in Iraq. This is where it's an old theme, right? We don't do reconciliation or reconstruction, really. But you have men and women, Israeli Defense Forces, Equal Opportunity Conscript Force. You have men and women on the streets in these Gazan towns, and you're saying you don't do reconciliation and reconstruction. Who is going to do it? I love this quote. We knew it was going to be a long haul, but we just didn't know how long a haul it was going to be. And partly it's because their own government isn't ready to sign a ceasefire. And you know, this Israeli division commander, you know, in The Economist, it just calls him that. But you know that any Israeli worth their salt knows who the hell said this, right? There are only so many division generals in Israel. All right, let's deal with Hamas. This is a terrorist group on our definition of it, and the British definition of it, and the Israeli definition, and the Australian definition. It goes on and on and on. They kill civilians. They did on 7 October. Let's make no bones about this. I mean, we can talk about why the movement is so popular among Palestinians, but it is a terrorist group by the nature of the tactics it uses. It was the government in Gaza, but it's been effectively decapitated, right? Yahya Sinwar was the guy who planned 7 October. And, you know, it's interesting. I mean, the Israelis are very good at, they call it targeted assassination. It was an IDF squad that encountered him on the streets of some Gazan city, and they got into a firefight and he died. Hamas is ideas. Think about that. It's a movement, it's got leaders, but it's a set of ideas. And this is an old problem for the US Army in Iraq, right? How do you battle an idea? How do you battle the hardcore Iraqi nationalists or the Islamists? Or, you know, they're rallying around a concept and a set of ideas. You can't bomb this idea out of existence. You can't bomb the idea of Palestinian nationhood out of a people or Islam out of a people. You can't do it. The Israelis have been pounding their head against this wall in Lebanon, to cite another example, for decades, and they still haven't done it. Now, I love Hamas. You're smart if you hang out in Qatar, right? 5-star hotel. You got the swimming pools, you got Qatar. They're giving you a nice, I'm sure these guys are paid by the Qatari government exorbitant amounts of money because Qatar wants to show, yeah, we're a player in the Middle East. We mediate conflicts, right? Slip some more cash to the Hamas guys. Stay here, right? Stay here, right? We want to negotiate with you. One was assassinated in Iran. One that counted was in Gaza. That was Yahya Sinwar. Again, this is a debate that we could probably have and it could go on for hours. If you take out the leadership of a movement, do you accomplish your goal or not? Right? The Israelis killed a guy named Hassan Nasrallah, who's the head of Hezbollah, another group, Lebanon, also enemy of Israel. And there's this kind of vacuum right now in the Hezbollah movement. Now, I think it's going to get filled because where there's one guy and he's killed, there's going to be another who's going to replace him. And who knows what you're going to get this time around, right? I mean, I don't know how you can get much more extreme than Yahya Sinwar, but maybe you can. And that's always the risk with this. These are our dilemmas. And this was written before our election. Israel's an ally. It is a bipartisan agreement, although these Republicans and Democrats pretend they agree on nothing. They do agree on China, and they do agree on Iran, and they do agree on Israel. They just don't like telling their constituents that. Israel is an ally. You're going to have to dig hard into the Democrat Party in particular. You might find a couple of politicians who are quite outspoken against Israel, but they're a minority. This ally of ours is in serious trouble. They have dug themselves a pit, or have had it dug for them, depending on how you want to argue that. And we're trying to help get them out of it. It's like, all right, guys, you've done it, right? You always said that 10 Palestinians for every Israeli killed. So 1,200 Israelis were killed in 7 October. 42,000, if you accept that number, of Palestinians were killed. Haven't you done enough? Right? Is the deterrent now been established? But I just mentioned that Netanyahu can't negotiate. He's got both hands behind his back. We're trying to push a new Gaza government. Somebody's got to govern that place. The Israelis ain't going to do it. And the IDF sure as hell is out of the business of being a military authority, trying to do civilian functions. And our prescription is, let's get the PA to do it. The people who lost the election in 2006, who have had no footprint in Gaza, really, since then, let's put them back in there, right? They'll run the show. I mean, West Bank is corrupt, it's nepotistic, all the usual Arab governance problems, but it's better than Hamas. This is our solution. Now, look, you've got to come up with a solution, right? I just don't think this is necessarily a good one. That's Mahmoud Abbas, 18 years into a 4-year mandate. He's one of these classic Arab leaders. He's probably got Alzheimer's. He mumbles a lot. No one knows exactly what he's saying at a moment. His government is intensely corrupt. There's a lot of nepotism, and it's completely disorganized. And the Israelis keep telling us, look, these are the knuckleheads you left us with as a result of Oslo, Come on, guys. It's obsolete. The ideology of the PLO dates to the 1960s. Now, I was born then at the tail end, and I would have to say that Arab nationalism, Arab socialism is kind of done. But this is all he's got. I think he ran out of ideas in 1996, and he doesn't have a new idea in his head since then. Oh, and let's just pretend for a moment. I'm almost done, I promise. Pretend for a moment that you are a police officer in the Palestinian Authority. And And you've just been told that you're going to be deployed to Gaza, because right now you're in Ramallah. That's home base. You're born there. I mean, you know the politics of Ramallah. You know all of the local goings on. You know who's corrupt, who isn't, who gets bribed, who pays you their bribes. You know, you're comfortable. And now you're going to be stuck in Gaza. And you know what? You're like, what the F? You're going to stick me in Gaza? Well, yeah, they're all Palestinians, right? This is what the Americans will say. You're all Palestinians, so you got to get along, right? Put you in Gaza. Are you kidding me? You're going to send me as a police officer into the middle of this war zone with the Israeli Defense Forces on the one hand, with the Hamas terrorists on the other, and you want me to set up a government. You want me to police. You've never been to Gaza. You know you're not popular in Gaza. You know, that Hamas has made it very clear that a single Palestinian Authority police officer who shows up in Gaza has got a bullet in her head. I mean, they're very abrupt about that. Don't mess in our business. We may be Palestinians, but only up to a point. What's your motivation going to be? Think about this. What's your motivation going to be? It's going to be zero. You're going to be paranoid. You're going to be hoping that the body armor you've got is going to be enough. And you're not going to go out and patrol much because you know these people hate you. They think you're an agent of the occupier. This is an expression that the development people are using. Mogadishu on the Med. This is not good. In other words, the fear that Gaza, it already is, but will descend further into anarchy. You know, and we know the common symptoms of anarchy in Mogadishu: criminal gangs, armed groups, routine human rights violations, famine. Again, food is control, food is power. And a given gang is not going to give food to an area unless that area pays up. I mean, this is extortion rackets. Hamas vengeance patrols. You know, these guys are out there like, we're going to get you use even the slightest sign of cooperation. I mean, you could stretch the analogy and think about, you know, a mafia neighborhood in the 1960s in the United States. I mean, it's the same kind of stuff that goes on, right? You know, there's monitoring, there's extortion, you got to know who to pay off. But I mean, this is on a Hamas level scale. All right, almost done. I promise, I keep saying that. Always easier to start a war, isn't it? And a lot harder to end one. How many times do we learn that lesson, you know, over and over again? In this case, though, this war ain't ending. I know it's not. You know, I've been anticipating the question tonight. So how are you going to solve all this mess? This war ain't ending soon. It's been going on for 75 years, and don't think for a second that it's going to end by the fiat of one American leader next month or next year. It's not going to end that way. A two-state solution, which was what Oslo was all about, it's not viable. I didn't have my slide up, which I probably should have kept there, about how many Israeli settlers are in the West Bank now, right? The numbers go up every year. Most of them are from Russia. And the Israelis are like, yes, welcome, you know, from the diaspora, but we're going to stick you in the West Bank. And now you've got 500,000 plus people who are Jewish settlers in the West Bank, and they ain't going anywhere. And Netanyahu is not going to pull them out. There's no one in any part of the Israeli political spectrum right now which is ready to sign up for that. So how are you going to create a Palestinian Authority, Palestinian state on that basis? Neither side is ready for peace. The Israelis are this much further down than they were even before October 7th. They all see what was on what we've all seen, right? The massacres, the rapes, the abductions. I mean, they had a grandmother on a motorbike, and they're abducting her and taking her into Gaza. I mean, here you just got to be like, oh my God, who is running PR on the Gaza and the Hamas side? Both are victims. They got the victimology down to a fine art, and that's not going to end. And when we come in there, we got some solutions for you.
this is what we think needs to happen. First of all, you guys need to have a ceasefire. Then we'll have the forces disengage, you on this side, you on that side. You know, they've heard this so many times from us over so many decades. It's just like, whoosh. What they're really saying is, all right, how much are you going to give us? PA too. We pay a lot of the PA's bills. How much are you going to give us? And we'll pay lip service to whatever you want. It does sound cynical, but that's the reality. So this is my last slide. The Israelis have got to adjust the goals. Now, right now, the political system is nowhere close to this. So we're going to have to wait for an election. And I'm not quite sure when that's going to happen, because Netanyahu's like, I don't want an election. I don't want an election. God, I'm down to like teens in my public support. Destroying Hamas is unrealistic. You couldn't destroy the PLO for the last 60 years. You're not going to destroy Hamas after, what, only 40 years, or Hezbollah. You're going to have to settle for the short truces. It doesn't make for an inspiring message, right? This is what we've been doing all along in Gaza. It's called kicking the can down the road just a little bit more. Seal the Gazan borders. Well, they've done that, but you're never going to be able to seal them completely. The tunnel networks are incredible. Hamas has got tunneling down to a fine art. They can bring a freaking missile through a tunnel from the desert. That is engineering. The red lines. The Israelis love talking about this. You do this, we'll do that. All right? Let's be very clear about this. They do this with Hezbollah all the time. Well, look where that got them, Hezbollah, in the last month or so. The Palestinians have got to adjust their goals too. Hamas has zero solutions. Al-Islam huwa al-hal, right? Islam is the solution. Oh, good luck. Where the hell has that gotten you since 2006? Well, it's because of the Israeli occupation. No, it's because your movement is as authoritarian and violent as its predecessors. Israel will not be eliminated. You know, from the river to the sea. I can't think, both sides view this, and it's like, God, if we're still at that stage of the game, we're back in 1950. I mean, I thought we had made progress since then, but no. Apparently one side's got to be eliminated. And after what we've seen the Israelis do to Lebanon in the last month, they're not going to be the ones who get eliminated. And by the way, in the end, my final kick, doesn't matter which government is in Washington, we have to stop pretending we're impartial, right? We're the impartial party. We want to bring both sides together. BS. There's an organization called the Arab-Israeli Political Affairs Committee, not action. It's a nicety in the word. It is one of the most influential lobbies in Washington, D.C., and it's got bipartisan influence. And you are not going to be able to kick that one over, especially after what happened in the election last week, because AIPAC has been shifting rightward for a number of years now. Those are our domestic realities. This is going to have to be one of these conflicts where we're just going to have to sit and go, I can't watch this anymore, right? Well, imagine living it, but they're still doing it. On that very cheerful, optimistic note, I'm going to stop and open it up for questions. Sir. Oh.
I was really fascinated when you said that the average age of the Gazans was 18. Has either side thought of how those people are being radicalized? I mean, that's a perpetuation. That's, you know, I'm Irish, and so I understand a little bit about what happened in the 6 counties and that sort of thing. And it was just the perpetuation of things. It went on and on and on forever until finally they reached some kind of a settlement. But it was much easier to do than what you're describing here. And that 18 years of age and what those people are experiencing at 18, they're going to be radicalized for the next 50, their lifetime.
Yep.
So has anybody thought about that seriously, do you think?
I don't, you know, among all the issues that both sides confront, I'm not sure that there's really, you know, an easy answer to that. I'm thinking as a parallel example of Afghanistan. I know we got out of there in 2021, but remember the average age in Afghanistan was 15. And a British general, always takes a Brit, doesn't it? Who said, you know, we're mowing the lawn every summer. And when the average age of your opponent is 15, we're going to be mowing the lawn until hell freezes over. It's just going to go on and on. And to be crass and cynical, but this is the reality that the Israeli Defense Forces face. I wouldn't want to be one of those conscripts maintaining a corridor in Gaza, knowing that my most likely opponent is going to be aged 18, is already radicalized, and has not a hope of employment in any near-term, medium-term future, because there's no development happening in Gaza. There's no reconstruction happening in Gaza. Netanyahu will not let that happen. And so, yeah, the grounds for radicalization are there. They've already happened. It's just a new crop. Horrible word to say, but I mean, it's true. That's the reality.
We're going to take a question from our folks on Teams as well. We have someone who's asking, why are international organizations such as the United Nations so ineffective in curbing genocide?
Yeah, it's funny because I'm going to be giving a talk for the Model UN in 2 weeks' time. And lest people forget, the UN is our creation. It's ours. We can't pretend as, like politicians in the US, I hate that organization. God, we're spending all this money on it and it does nothing. We created it. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, Winston Churchill, right? I mean, this is the origins of the Atlantic Charter, which is where the UN is. So we can't pretend like it's like this, ugly stepchild that we want to have nothing to do with. It's ours. And it's been under assault for a long time, not just from us. The question about the UN and Gaza in particular gets woven into an organization called the UN, it's UNRWA, Reconstruction Assistance. I'm forgetting my UN acronym. It's almost as old as the UN itself. It was created to help the settlement of Palestinian refugees after the first war, the 48-49 one. Now, it's been under a lot of fire because it just so happens there's some Hamas guys on the ground working for UNRWA, I'll call it UNRWA, who, obviously have a very certain opinion about how the reconstruction assistance is going. So the UN hasn't done itself any favors either. Talk about shooting your foot off. I mean, you got Hamas guys in your organization, and for the Israelis, this is like throwing red meat in front of them. It's like, we knew we hated that organization. Now we know why. There's an organization called the UN Truce Supervisory Organization, UNSO. It's as old as the UN, created in the late 40s, whose job was to monitor ceasefires between Israel and its Arab neighbors. It's still in existence. Has it been effective? Well, no. It's a great gig. A neighbor of mine on South Hills was in UNSO back in the 70s, and he said it was a great gig, but as a U.S. soldier, he was assigned to it. But in terms of effectiveness, it was zero. So unfortunately, the UN does not have a very good record. Now, on the Israeli side of the ledger, let's face it, they do not want to deal with the UN, period. Especially when there's a UN agency called the Court of Justice, where I think it was South Africa, right, is referring Israel to the Court of Justice for genocide as a result of the past year. And for the Israelis, this is like even more confirmation of why they do not trust this agency. Israel, in the end, falls back on us. We're it. And so to pretend that we're not part of this conflict or we're somehow aloof from it, well, no, we're tied at we're literally attached at the hip with these guys. For better or worse, it's just the way it is. And the UN is not going to come between that, and never has and never will, frankly. The trust isn't there.
So I've seen a lot of talking points, especially about how after World War II and the effects of Jewish genocide and how that relates to the approach being taken, especially in purging Gaza, essentially. Do you think that plays a significant or maybe a minor role in the lack of a strong response by the UN?
So if you could reframe that question, I'm just.
So I guess as a more direct way to put it,
Mhm.
how do you think the World War II affected the lack of approach from Western countries, especially?
Okay. Guilt. To be blunt, right? I mean, there's the famous story of Jan Karski, who was a Polish underground, who went to Franklin Roosevelt and said they're gassing people in these camps. And, it'd be great if you could send some bombers over and drop passports on them, make them Americans. We didn't do that. I mean, there's all sorts of reasons, I'm sure. Or the ships that were turned away, right? With refugees, Jewish refugees from Europe. So there's guilt there. The Germans have no choice in this. They're one of the top money givers to Israel, and that won't end anytime soon. I'm reminded, though, of a certain Saudi king. His name was Abdulaziz ibn Saud. And when Roosevelt met Ibn Saud in the Suez Canal, they had this big powwow in the Suez Canal. Roosevelt said, it'd be great if you could convince these Arab Palestinians to let more Jewish settlers arrive, because there's been this horrible thing that's happened in Europe. There's been this genocide. This was 1945. Roosevelt had like 2 weeks left to live. And Ibn Saud sat back and said, it's not our problem. It's your problem. Why don't you carve a piece out of the United States, Ibn Saud said, for all these Jewish refugees from Europe? Or better yet, Ibn Saud said, why don't you carve a piece out of Germany for them? Why does it have to be at our expense, right? So this debate has been going on for a hell of a long time. Now, the Israelis have an expression, and as an intel guy, I used to deal with them a lot. And by the way, they are the most aggressive intel collectors you'll ever imagine. I mean, you will give a position, right, analysis, and they'll want to know what the facts are under the analysis. And that can be kind of sensitive, right? It's intelligence. It's, what you got from something overhead that's spying, or a telephone, or whatever, right? So they're definitely wired into this sort of thing. And I've lost my train of thought here. The question, comes down to Israeli trust in international institutions, and it's just not going to be there. It never has been, from 1947 to the present. And in the end, we're the ones who are going to have to help ease them out. So I think there's a position for us to say we're impartial, or not, that we're not impartial, but we're really the only country that can talk to the Israelis and possibly convince them to, in our view, come to their senses on some of these wars.
Okay, well, on that note, we had an election last week, and it's been a fascinating lead up to that election with things like the Dearborn mayor of Michigan endorsing Trump. Can you speak to what your thoughts are? We've got Mike Huckabee now as the new ambassador to Israel. Trump, what his relationship with Netanyahu? Can you speak to what you think, what direction our foreign policy is going to take with this new administration coming in terms of this conflict?
I think we are going to see, in some ways, a much closer relationship with the Israelis than we've had for the last 4 years. And partly it's because, in the end, I mean, Joe Biden got on that plane and flew to Israel on, October 8th. It didn't matter. They hate each other. It's politics. It's politics. Now, with the Trump administration, you're going to see a restoration of what we saw 2016 to 2020. Remember, Trump did several things: moving the embassy, from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. Big deal, right? We all along on our diplomatic front said no embassy until a final settlement of the status of Jerusalem. And the Israelis kept telling us, it's settled, it's ours. I went, well, we're not really ready for that yet, right? Trump said, I don't care. Move the embassy. The other thing that happened was, and this almost passed unnoticed, but the U.S. position now is that the Golan Heights is not occupied territories, that is part of Israel. Now, that again, it's a territory conquered in war. And according to the United Nations, you know, our blasted stepchild, that is still debatable what the status will be. Is it part of a future peace settlement between Syria and Israel? And as far as Netanyahu is concerned and Donald Trump is concerned, it ain't. It's solved. It's resolved. Now, if I were Israeli, I'd want to hang on to the Golan Heights, but that's just me, you know, from a geopolitical standpoint. I think you're going to see a permissiveness of Benjamin Netanyahu's worst instincts. And what I mean by that is there's going to be no restraint on him with Lebanon. I mean, they've already done a number on Lebanon, right? I mean, the last war was 2006. This one is rapidly approaching the destructiveness of that one. But the 2006 war didn't end so well for the Israelis. Hezbollah was much more entrenched than they anticipated. And in the end, they had to settle for a ceasefire negotiated by us, by Condoleezza Rice specifically. I think there's going to be no restraints on Israel with the incoming administration. There's no interest in it, right? Remember, it was a member of that party, was it Lindsey Graham, who said, you know, why don't we just nuke Gaza? You know, let's be honest. This is some of the rhetoric that's going on that side. But in the end, it's a bipartisan issue. And in the end, I don't see, with the exception of maybe a couple of Democrats from the Minneapolis area saying, wait a minute, we're going to do what? I don't think there's going to be a lot of criticism unless this war with Lebanon keeps going on and drags on. Now, the other big factor is Iran. Now, do I think we're going to go to war with Iran? You know, no. We're going to let the Israelis do that one. But is there going to be restraints on what the Israelis are going to bomb in Iran in the future, like there has been up until now, supposedly? I mean, this is all media stuff. No. There's no interest in mitigating that war either. So in a way, the Israelis have gone over the edge and they're pulling us with them, right? And we're not going to be in a position to say, hey, wait a minute. You know, let's stop and think about this. Remember one of the things that Joe Biden said on October 8th or October 9th, he said, don't repeat the mistakes that we made in Iraq. Those are lessons learned the hard way. And I don't see that kind of advice coming from the incoming president.
All right, we have time for one more question. We can also take a question from Zoom. Okay, our final question. Let's see, we have a couple we haven't gone through. Is there anything that can be done by the people in Palestine, in Gaza, to actually push back on the Hamas regime?
No. It's a shadow government. And like all shadow governments, it uses coercion. It is a violent racket. I mean, I'm not saying that Hamas wouldn't get elected tomorrow, because they probably would, right? We're not the only ones who get shocked by our own elections. I think in the case of Hamas, though, you cannot criticize this movement, even if you were inclined that way, by the way. I don't think you're going to find very many people in Gaza right now saying, man, this Hamas, look at the load of crap they've just dumped on us, right? And they're not even living here. They're in Qatar. You know, I'd like to live in Qatar as Joe Gaza, but I don't. I have to live here with the consequences of the decisions they make. But it's going to be really hard. This is police work, right? And it's not going to be a Palestinian Authority police officer who's going to do this, but you're going to have to go into those mean streets, tunnels. No one likes tunnels, right? If you ever read the book, The Tunnels of Cu Chi, you know, Vietnam War stuff, this is not where you want to end up as a soldier. But this is where Hamas is. And as a coercive government, in the end, I mean, yeah, the ideology might be appealing on some level, but in the end, if you step out of line, there are consequences. And it's not just you, it's your family as well. This is how insurgencies work.
Well, thank you again, Owen, and thank all of you for attending tonight, and we welcome you to join us outside for reception.